Good afternoon to all our speakers and viewers joining us from across the globe. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online discussion hosted by the Asia Freedom Institute, which is a non-profit organization that promotes democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Butt, and I'm the moderator for today's really interesting topic on 2024 Indian general election results and India China relations. And joining me for this discussion, I'm honored to introduce you to our pertinent speakers Mr. Manoj Joshi, Distinguished Fellow at the ORF Observers Research Foundation. Uh, Dr. Swati Chawla, Associate Professor at Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities, Adil Brar, China news reporter for Newsweek, Dr. Jabin Thomas Jacob, Associate Professor at Shivnagar University. I have deliberately kept the introduction of our speakers precise to save more time for our discussion. But if you want to get the full bio of our speakers, you can always go to Asia Freedom Institute's website. And the agenda for today is we are going to have only 5 questions intended to all our speakers, and all our speakers will have only 3 minutes to give your answers. So, without further ado, I would like to begin with the first question, and I would like to begin with Mr. Manoj. Sorry, Dr. Manoj, followed by Adil and Dr. Jabin. And we are not going to have Dr. Swati in the first round of the question. We will be having her in the rest of our questions, but not in the first. So, Dr. Manoj, I will be starting off with you. And I would like to start off with the result of the recent Indian general elections. This election witnessed a significant increase in the voter turnout. It seemed like many people would actually see a new change in the government, as those vying for the election were almost neck to neck with each other. And this time, BJP's opposition party, led by the International Congress, had made a strong comeback as compared to the 2019 elections. So instead of BJP winning a majority of the seats, we now have a coalition government in New Delhi. This whole election was something that really grabbed the eyeballs of the entire nation. So tell us how much attention did the Indian elections receive in China, and what were the dominant views in state-owned media among scholars and analysts, and on Chinese social media, and how big of an issue was foreign policy and China in the elections? Dr. Manoj, we'll start with you. Dr. Manoj, you'll have to unmute.
I must tell you to start with upfront, I'm not a person who is a Mandarin speaker or reader. So I often read the comments and others as translations and from secondary and tertiary sources. As far as the reactions in China, I'm not so sure that the Chinese even focused on the election. Even the average Chinese person would focus on the elections. I did get some queries from Hong Kong news media outlets on the elections, but nothing very substantial. As far as relations with China are concerned, uh, this time around, foreign policy didn't figure very much in the election. This time, a lot of the focus of the elections was on internal issues. Sadly, a lot of it was kind of divisive issues, disruptive issues, not a very elevated kind of a debate. But foreign policy, for some reason, didn't figure. Unlike 2019, where Pakistan was a major entity that figured. So, in all honesty, I'd say that as far as India-China relations are concerned, they have been kind of more or less ignored through the election process. There was a well-known interview of the Prime Minister given to Newsweek before the elections, which I would count as part of the election process in a certain way, where he made some remarks which were fairly positive on the possibility of improving ties between India and China. That's about all I guess I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj. You said that there is hardly any attention given from China, and there is not much attention paid even to the foreign policy. And Adil, you live in Taiwan, so we would like to know what kind of energy was there towards the Indian election there. Can you give us your perspective on the overall situation? Adil, you have to unmute.
Thank you, Sakina. It's good to be here with such a distinguished panel. Let me start by saying I will echo some of the ideas that Dr. Joshi mentioned. The elections did not quite capture the imagination in China or even in Taiwan as much. The internal dynamics of domestic politics in India rarely kind of get the attention in China because they don't understand how these democratic processes work. That being said, there were certain things that we could see were being discussed. One issue is kind of highlighting difficulties in conducting elections. Like, there were polling officers who had to go through, different processes, and getting to places was difficult. And heat strokes, people were dying because of heat stroke. That issue was highlighted by China. It's again one of the classic examples where Chinese state media and social media highlight these difficulties because they want to project, a certain agenda that these democratic elections are not good for a large population like India. And this is kind of a domestic projection that goes on. So I didn't see that as something new. It was expected and it happened. The other thing would be that there were certain comments about, Prime Minister Modi's re-election and what will that mean for India, its economy. And what happened with the stock market most recently was widely discussed on Chinese social media, which was very interesting to me. So I would say it remained a side issue. It did not, like history suggests, never has been a kind of central issue in China because the understanding about democracy in India, the political parties, is very weak. I did not see any discussion about opposition, Congress, or JDU or other parties, because that remains a subject that maybe some experts in China know well enough to talk about, but a larger population don't really understand these issues. And similarly, even in Taiwan, the issue of elections was linked to, if Prime Minister Modi will get the mandate that he was hoping to, and what that means for India-Taiwan relations broadly, the semiconductor, mission that India set up, and will that go forward? So broadly remained in that spectrum. And the Newsweek interview was something interesting that we can discuss perhaps in the next round. So I'll get to that later.
Thank you so much, Adil. Let's move on to Dr. Jacob.
Thank you, Sakina. Let me begin with the question about China in the Indian elections. A colleague and I did a study on how China was discussed or not discussed in the different election manifestos of political parties. And it was quite surprising, or maybe not surprising, that at least the ruling party did not discuss China at all, because clearly China is the one major area of foreign policy, foreign and security policy failure in the last government. But other political parties do address China. They do talk about, a couple of other political parties do talk about China and the threat from China on the borders and so on, very briefly in their manifestos. But overall, as Dr. Manoj Joshi said, foreign policy in general is not a big issue in Indian elections. And this time, there wasn't much of a constraint, at least from the Pakistani side. So there was not even Pakistan discussed so much. But having said that, I think if we come to how India has been discussed, or whether India was much of an, or the Indian elections were much of an issue in China itself, I agree with Adil. There is Communist Party of China line that to project negative information, people dying, heat strokes, all sort of difficulties to show that, they have to cover the issue in some fashion, but if they cover it at all, then they have to cover it in a way that projects the negative side of it. But I think what is more interesting is what has happened post-elections. What have the discussions been in the Chinese media post-elections? And here, as Adil pointed out, there are, of course, analysts in China who, study these issues. But analysis, or their analysis, is not what appears in the media. I mean, that analysis is probably only for closed, only for certain eyes behind closed doors. But what they project in the media is a certain party line. So they work their way backwards, which is, what is the party line on India and Indian elections or Indian democracy? Obviously, the Communist Party of China is against democracy and against the idea of India becoming an example for China. So the idea is to start with that line and then discuss whatever needs to be discussed. And there are at least two lines or two sort of broad points that I think emerge from the discussion post-elections. One is that Prime Minister Modi has a weaker mandate this time, and therefore, because of coalition pressures, he's likely to take a more nationalist view or a more Hindutva or Hindu nationalist approach. Now, what the Chinese are doing here is obviously setting things up in a way to say that, well, if there is a problem on the border, on the LAC, you can blame the Indians because they are under pressure because of coalition politics or because of democratic pressures. So the Chinese are going to take advantages of this, and this is something that we have to keep an eye out for. A second line, I think there have been several mentions of ideological differences between the US and India. I mean, the Chinese are again, obviously don't like the idea of India and US getting closer together, and so they feel that they must highlight differences between India and the US. And one of this is to talk about the differences, tensions about questions of democracy and democratic institutions, etc., in India that the US has been raising. And so to highlight differences between, two countries where I think are going to only build their relationships even more stronger than has been the case even until now. That is between India and the United States.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacob. I think Dr. Manoj wants to make a point on this issue. Dr.
Yes, I would like to make a point. I think that I'm not so sure what was the significance of China sending its ambassador to India, Xu Feihong, on May in the middle of the election process. Mm-hmm. So whether they wanted a signal or whether it was something like that, I think only would require deeper analysis. But it was something somewhat strange that after 18 months, Chinese ambassador comes here and he comes plunk in the middle of the elections. And I was just checking up that last time when the election took place in May 2019, as the elections were going on, China for the first time lifted the bar it had on declaring Masood Azhar as a terrorist under the 1267 Sanctions Committee. All of that happened one happened just before the election, the other happened during the election. There's some kind of a signal there. I'm not so sure what it's all about.
Okay, thank you so much to all our speakers for this really informative answer regarding the attention that the Indian elections had from China. I think we are very clear about it now. So we'll move on with the second. We'll move on with the second question, and here we're going to start with Dr. Jacob. So, Mr. Modi, in an April 2024 interview with Newsweek, spoke about abnormality in India's relations with China. And Minister Jaishankar has said currently that normal relations are impossible between the two countries. And many experts also believe that the relationship between India and China is at its worst since the 1962 war. The clash in the Galwan Valley in June 2020 between the Indian and the Chinese soldiers in eastern Ladakh is seen as a critical moment that worsened the India-China relations. The clash happened just after 6 months after Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping had a supposedly positive informal meeting at Mahabalipuram. So why did this clash occur in the first place? Like, what happened? Because Prime Minister Narendra Modi is one of the leaders who had visited China multiple times, I think like 5 times as the Prime Minister and 4 times as the Chief Minister of Gujarat. How did this relationship between the two countries, India and China, deteriorate so quickly? Dr. Jacob, we'll start with you on this.
I think the signs were always there. I mean, at least since 2013, we've been seeing different instances since 2013 on the line of actual control. Chinese transgressions have been changing both in terms of quality and scale. So, and if nothing else, 2017, the Doklam clash was also enough signal for and the way the Chinese responded to Indian pushback, both with the sort of media campaign, a racist media campaign against the Indians, and so on. I think the signs were always there, so it was to an extent a certain gullibility of the Indian government, an unwillingness of the Indian government to see the signs, to see the writing on the wall, and to sort of live by its illusions. 2017 was actually an opportunity to scale up attention, to begin to be on guard. But instead, we had the informal summits. This was a completely unaccountable exercise, a complete. The result, I would say, of a complete misreading and a misunderstanding of how the Chinese operate. So any talk of now of saying this is an abnormality or the situation on the border is not normal, I think is too little, too late. I would say that the opening up, the government has been, and the government repeated this post 2017 sort of an exercise even on the eve of the elections right now, which is it started opening up to think tanks from China, started giving these signals, this interview that Prime Minister Modi gave to Newsweek, for example. As Dr. Manoj Joshi said, this is some sort of a positive signal that the Prime Minister tried to give China. I think all of this was really related or connected to only the elections. I think the Indian government didn't want the Chinese doing anything that would make life difficult for the government during the elections or in the run-up to the elections. Because unlike last time where Pakistan was an issue, Pakistan is now an old issue. Nobody would be bothered so much. But China is something that everybody is now beginning to pay attention to. And this is, like I said before, is not an area where the government has actually covered itself in glory. So the key point, as you said, is that Galwan came barely 6 months after the second informal summit between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping at Mahabalipuram. Which only suggests that the Indian side was taken for a ride by the Chinese. The strategic guidance that Xi Jinping is supposed to have given his military seems to be really about upping the scale of Chinese transgressions on the LAC rather than telling them to tone down. So, I don't see that we can have. That we should be surprised that India-China relations unraveled, because the Chinese have never been interested. If you look at their speeches, their documents, their actions, they have not actually been interested in making things right with the Indians. And it's the Indians always who are taking the lead in trying to make things okay. And that attitude has to change.
Dr. Jacob, and also you've been traveling to many of India's border states and visited parts of India's disputed borders with China. So what was the situation like there?
Well, it's been a while since I've been traveling on the borders, but look, I think the major difference that we should highlight is the heavy buildup of infrastructure on the Indian side. Of course, this is not something that started just 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. This has been a long process. It's been underway for a couple of decades now. And partly the Chinese are reacting to this infrastructure buildup by the Indians. Because the Chinese are now seeing that all these treaties were only useful for the Chinese when the Indians were at standstill in terms of their infrastructure capabilities or their access to the LAC. But today, the Indians are able to access areas where they could not access before. Because of infrastructure development. And this is something that the Chinese want to, one reason why transgressions have increased is, one, Indian and Chinese troops are coming more into contact with each other. But also the Chinese want to take advantage of whatever little advantage that they have in terms of their border capabilities before the Indians build up. And so that's why we have these clashes. That is why we have greater aggression by the Chinese on the LAC and this constant targeting of India for being aggressive. Whereas the Indians are only responding to what the Chinese have been doing for much, much longer.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. And Dr. Manoj, you have authored the book titled Understanding the India-China Border in 2022. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well? Um, you need to unmute. Okay. All right. I think we have a slight glitch. I think we'll just move forward with Adil. Adil, can you give us your perspective? Because you have written this really interesting piece on the India and China border, and you have written many pieces, but then one that I was really interested in was when the Chinese, they built their strategy by using the Tibetans. Once I think Doctor, I'm just getting a little distracted by Dr. Manoj. Adil, I'm so sorry. Okay, so so I wanted to talk to you about the military strategy by recruiting the Tibetan youth. So can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Sakina. I think it is part of the broader process that Dr. Jacob was mentioning. China has taken a certain view of its relations with India, so they are using all kinds of strategies to, improve their overall, capabilities on the Chinese side of the border, which includes working with the locals, Tibetan communities on the Chinese side, or essentially Tibet. They want to recruit the locals so that they have a better knowledge of the geography. That has always been an issue for the PLA. Staying in these higher ground areas, high altitude areas, surviving there is not easy. So they realize that now they need to kind of enhance, this strategy that they've had for a long time. I'm not going to say that they've not tried it before, but they've come to a realization that this requires a bit more attention than before, because they suffered during the time in Galwan when the clashes happened. The soldiers were brutally injured, especially suffered because of the cold weather climate that exists in that region. And we've seen videos of Chinese soldiers talking about the difficulty of surviving and showing their hands, which are quite visibly impacted by the cold climate of that particular geography. So Tibetans, on the other hand, have a long history, a long understanding of what goes on in these areas and how to save yourself, the language capability. And so China is now doubling down on that strategy by hiring more people, paying them more salaries. And this is what I've discovered in my own research of social media platforms, that they are paying higher salaries, better benefits than before, because they want these soldiers to become part of the PLA, to adopt the ideology of the party. And talking about the broader dynamic briefly of the India-China relations, I think the signs were there, as Dr. Jacob mentioned, since 2017 and even before. It would be, it was India's mistake that we did not react on time, take the measures required before what happened in June 2020. It was a surprise, and a lot of people are still trying to make sense of it. We don't know the exact reason, the exact official line, and we may never know that. But we can read the kind of messaging that has come from Beijing, which includes talking about India-US relations and getting back to India because it has a burgeoning economy, a promising status on international affairs that really, for China is a threatening thing. And so they're responding in the way they have. And you've seen this with the deployment and the continued deployment, which I think will go on for the next few years.
Thank you so much, Adil. Dr. Manoj, I'll get back to you. Apologies for the inconvenience. I think there was a little tech glitch that happened there. You need to unmute, Dr. Manoj.
Okay. No, it wasn't a glitch. What happened was that your Leave Studio is right beneath the mute, and I pressed that by accident. But whatever it is, as far as your question is concerned, my book on understanding the India-China border actually takes off from the 2020 incidents, and then it goes back and forth on the border issue and the Sino-Indian issues, which include, the old issues, 1993 agreement, 96 agreement, the effort to resolve issues using the special representatives mechanism, the various problems that we've had on the border, then Doklam, So it looks at various issues. My own understanding of that border is that the Chinese have wanted to maintain a dominant position on the border. Meaning their bottom line is that we must be dominant. And so when the Indians start constructing infrastructure, they start getting nervous. And I think in 2020, many things came to head. See, between 2016 and 2019, okay, we may have had informal dialogue with China, informal summits with China, but our relations with the United States were getting distinctly closer. In 2016, we signed 2 of the so-called foundational agreements to bring our militaries closer. In 2019, we got the Strategic Trade Authorization, STA-1 status from the US. Then we signed the Industrial Security Agreement in 2019. 2017, as you know, Quad had been revived. So when the Chinese looked at all this, they also saw an India which was getting distinctly closer to the US. So what they did in 2020 was an effort to coerce us. The sudden deployment of 2 divisions in eastern Ladakh, the blockades in 6 different places in eastern Ladakh was an attempt to, as I said, coerce us. It was not classic aggression because they did not attack any Indian post, but they blockaded us in certain areas where by mutual consent earlier both of us used to patrol. Now the thing is that in Galwan, things went out of hand. Things went out of hand. 20 Indians died. This created a lot of uproar, and basically what it did was to wash away the trust that we were trying to painfully build up with regard to border issues since 1993. We were trying to steadily, through various confidence building measures, build up trust. But what happened in 2020 was that that trust got destroyed. And what the Prime Minister was really talking about in that Newsweek interview, saying that, we need to urgently address the issue of the prolonged situation in our borders so that abnormality in our bilateral relations can be put behind us. So I think that has now become very central. Earlier, the whole belief was that let's put the border aside and let's build normal relations otherwise. Now I think there is a much clearer understanding that we need to fix this border issue. Unless this border issue is fixed, nothing else will be fixed. And I think the Chinese know that very well. But the Chinese want to have a border which is not fixed so that they can periodically turn up the heat on us. But now the situation has arisen, as Javin has brought out, that we are not going to back off. Our infrastructure build-up is also continuing. I, for one, don't think that either country is capable of war across the Himalaya. But there can be a lot of large skirmishes right across the Himalaya. But this time, India is ready. In 2020, I think we dropped the ball for a while, but now we are ready. And I think this is very obvious. There are various indicators that the Indians are now also adopting a fairly aggressive posture in patrolling the line of actual control.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manoj, for very clearly walking us through the entire process of the Galwan Valley clash. I would like to move forward with Dr. Swati Chawla. Let's hear your perspective on this.
Thank you. A lot has already been said. Just a couple of points. So this, when I was hearing everybody on the last question about elections, I was reminded also of the G20 summit that was last year in September, and this idea that India was the Vishwa Guru, and the speculation till the last minute about what the Chinese position was going to be, whether Xi Jinping was going to come, not come. And then this came up in the opinion polls in the lead up to the election, that a lot of people felt that India's international image had been bolstered, and that was one of the things in favor of Prime Minister Modi's candidature. So just that quick point. I do agree with on this question with Jabin and Adil that the signs have been there for a while. And in fact, it's the Tibetans in India who've been saying this. It's so when this happened, actually, several of the Tibetan commentators on Indian television and other media outlets said, we've been sounding the alarm on this for a very long time, and perhaps, we haven't really been listening. On this point about the heavy infrastructure buildup on the borders, just to add to Jabin points, there is the Vibrant Villages program that the union government, sponsored by the union government from 22-23 through to 25-26, which has earmarked about 3,000 villages across India's northern and eastern borders. Right, so it's across states in Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, and Ladakh. And the program has also authorized establishing several units of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. So almost 9,000, inducting 9,000 troops. So I think this is the sense of preparedness that Manoj just mentioned. So I think we need to just wanted to add that point. And finally, another thing that had happened in January, January of 2021, was that the Indian Army said that its officers should also study Tibetology. So, what Adil was saying, inducting Tibetans, because they have a better sense of the climate, they can adapt better to those conditions, they know the language. So on the Indian side as well, the Indian Army said that its officers should get training in Tibetology and identified a bunch of institutes across India, many of which were started or have been shepherded by the Tibetans in exile. So I think they're right to emphasize the Tibet, and I know we'll come to this in the following two questions, but I think that's perhaps was an important consequence of the clashes as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swati, for raising this really interesting topic on how the Indians in the border should adopt the Tibetology thing. Thank you. And and Xi Jinping and the Chinese diplomats, they keep bringing up an expanding list of red lines and core interests like Taiwan and One China Principle, Hong Kong, South China Sea, East Turkestan, Tibet, etc. And India could make Tibet a key issue too, but hasn't done so yet. So, resolving the Tibet issue quickly and peacefully could help solve the border dispute with China, as it is the historical Indo-Tibet border that has now become the primary bone of contention between India and China. So this could also benefit India by gaining support in Buddhism and addressing water security issues, given Tibet's position as a third pole. So is there a difference between India's cautious political stance on Tibet and perhaps a desire for a more aggressive stance by the military? What should India's policy on Tibet be? Swati, will go with you.
Thank you. So I think let's start with the last question. And also, I think this is something that I've noticed in many debates on India-China relations, or actually many debates on international relations more broadly. So this sort of my humble submission as a historian would be, even when we frame these questions, to actually center people. So it isn't about, what benefits India in the abstract, or China in the abstract, but what benefits people. I think that's what's important. So what is at stake in the resolution of the boundary dispute for people on both sides of that boundary? Many of, so I think that's just sort of a note of caution in the framing. But what should be India's policy? And this is something a colleague of Jabin's, Professor Siddiq Wahid, says that, his pet peeve is that India can't have a China policy without a Tibet policy, and it can't have a Tibet policy without a Himalayan policy. So both interstate Himalaya, but also, the Himalayan, vast Himalayan regions within India. So I think that is, it's certainly, something that we will need to center Tibetan and Himalayan people when we talk about India-China relations. To your question about, I think climate is another important aspect that is often now forgotten. I mean, I'm in Delhi right now, and we are, all of us are witnessing the extreme effects of climate change. And again, I would say Tibetans in exile have been sounding the alarm on the impact on Tibet's fragile ecosystem of Chinese policies such as, damming, even things like the forced sedentarization of nomadic populations. What does that do to ways of life? And large parts of South Asia are sustained. So Tibet as the third pole, large parts of South Asia are sustained by rivers that originate on the Tibetan plateau. So I think again, the people of these regions, but of South Asia more broadly, have a stake in what happens in Tibet. And I think it really needs to be, and again, to give credit to Tibetans in exile, the Dalai Lama himself, in both the Strasbourg proposal, the 5-point peace plan, back in the 80s, had mentioned environment as a very, very important, like as a central tenet of what the Tibetan movement for autonomy was all about. And I think the connection here with South Asia, with large parts of India, but across South Asia, that is something we need to, again, it's not India-China relations in the abstract. And I think environment is a very important way to foreground that. I think I'll stop here. If I have something else, I'll come back.
Sure, Dr. Swati, and thank you so much for bringing out various issues related to Tibetans as well. Adil, let's hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the question about the Newsweek interview. Just for the record, I was not part of that interview for research or other aspect of it. But the reaction from China to what Prime Minister Modi said was very interesting. They were quite happy with the fact that Prime Minister Modi, mentioned that he wanted a somewhat of a stable relation with China, which was the way I saw it was not exactly anything new. We've been saying that, ME has been saying that. It read like a statement by the MEA because the deterrence or the escalation dynamic here between India and China is quite complex. So Prime Minister has to be careful about, saying certain things which maybe the foreign minister can say. But the way China reacted, the state media, comments and also the foreign ministry comment was quite positive, and it tells you that they are happy with the way things are going because they've achieved a certain goal, which is, deterring India, coercing India as well. And they are continuing with the construction of large airports on the Chinese side. There are major airports coming up for military, for dual use, and other infrastructure that's coming up, including highways passing through Aksai Chain and Tibet. And that gives China a certain sense of assurance that their strategy is working. Because on the Indian side, I hear a lot of people that, they say, oh, China may have just lost India. They've done certain things which will actually hurt China. But on the other hand, I think China is quite happy with the way things are going. And that reaction to the interview for me was a confirmation of what really China desires from this dynamic. And they're not going to stop here. It's going to continue in the Modi 3.0 government, and we will see more clashes because there is no way ahead of here. The talks are not working. The diplomatic side of things is, it's still there, and they are continuing to conduct exercises pretty much on a weekly basis. This may not make the headlines, but if you go look at open source material, you come across, exercises continuing to happen, especially in the Eastern Ladakh region. So I don't see a way forward, and China remains quite reassured with the way things are going. And this kind of coalition government that we have now, maybe China sees that it's a good thing for them, because I've read some comments online saying it's a good thing for China because Prime Minister Modi will be busy with the coalition politics and may not be able to focus on economy, transforming India's economy into something that can challenge Beijing. So from here, I don't think China sees itself at a back foot. That's for the analysts to decide if they are or not. But in their own perception, I think they consider themselves doing pretty well so far.
And Ardit, can you also add what do you think about India's policy on Tibet be like?
Yeah, it's quite sad that we've not been able to get this question of Tibet, at this heart of, what's going on right now. We've sidelined it. It's not been discussed as much. And there are other factors which I don't want to quite get into, including domestic politics and other factors of why we've kind of sidelined this whole topic. But what comes as an important, juncture is that now certain ideas may be revisited with what happened. This is not related to Tibet, but what happened with the Prime Minister Modi's exchange with President Lai Ching-te, mentioning Taiwanese president in a post on X was something unprecedented. It has never happened before. And I think it kind of tells you maybe in the future, Tibet has an opportunity to come back as a central issue of this India-China debate. It will take probably more crisis to get there, but at the moment, I'm not hearing any experts talking about it. It's always India-China as this one, two big countries with major firepower, and that's the central topic. But on the other hand, China is using the Tibet issue in an interesting way, where they are telling the people that, oh, look, we are giving you all these amazing things. You should be happy with the development. India is not able to catch up with the narrative of that. We have not been able to give a proper answer to why Tibet, deserves better. And this is where it's a lost opportunity for India. I think there's a lot of things that India can do in terms of that, the policy side of things, the actual build-up side of things, but we've not been able to kind of use it because the policy side of things is right now caught up in the military escalation, which takes up the time of everybody. I think in the system, this is my own analysis, everybody is so busy kind of responding to these circular events where they are not able to kind of get to the nitty-gritty of things, learning Tibetology in a very superficial way, the way we teach Chinese is not really translating into anything significant in terms of policy.
Thank you so much, Adil. Let's hear Dr. Manoj. Let's hear your perspective on this.
Well, the thing with Tibet is a complex issue. No country in the world ever recognized Tibet as an independent entity. Indian policy, there were certain options in 1946, 47, 48, but at that time, the CPC had not even won in China. But they were examined, but India lacked the physical capacity to do anything at that time. But don't forget that the Tibetans themselves signed away their independence with the 1951 agreement, which was approved by the Kashag. And so what India's strategy was that somehow we can persuade China to have an autonomous Tibet. Even today, I think the emphasis is on autonomy. At that time, it was autonomy, and so that the Chinese don't even send the PLA there. But the Communist Party of China had very different ideas as to what autonomy is all about. And so this has meant physical control of Tibet. I think undoing all that is not a simple task. I'm saying you cannot change tracks having recognized the 1954 agreement that Tibet is an autonomous region of China. I don't think India can easily undo that unless there are certain developments both in Tibet and in China. So those are issues which are outside our control. But I must point out to you that the Chinese are very paranoid about India's approach to Tibet, because they know that of all the countries in the world, India has as much of a cultural influence on Tibet as China has, if not more. And geographically also. I mean, you have to look at the map and you see what the relationship is all about, or can be all about. And so many people say 1962 war, for example, was also a result of Chinese paranoia on Tibet. They're afraid that somehow or the other, the Indians will do something which will lead to Tibetan independence. Now, right now, I don't think Chinese are too worried. They have physical control over Tibet, and I don't see any prospect at this juncture of that control loosening. So whatever happens with regard to the future of Tibet, it will be decided in Tibet and in China itself. I'm not so sure that external intervention can initiate a process. External intervention can come as a reaction. And I'm not so sure also, of course, a lot of things are linked with the Dalai Lama, his reincarnation, his future reincarnation, or the lack of reincarnation. The Tibetan community itself, its influence progressively declines because as generations after generations grow up. So this is a very unfortunate kind of a situation. But as I said, the solution to that is really something happening in China itself. I mean, China is a very big country, very powerful country. Chinese politics are very complex. And unless there are developments there, I don't see easy answers to Tibet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. We'll move on to Dr. Jabin.
Okay, so I sort of agree with all of my colleagues, on the question of, the points that they've raised, the points that Adil has raised on how the Chinese are looking at these issues. I think those, and how we've been responding, with these courses on Tibetology, etc., that Swati and Adil have raised. I think those are very, very important and germane to this discussion. India's Tibet policy, I'm not sure that we ever had a Tibet policy to start with. We had a policy of ensuring the preservation of Tibetan culture within India, the best possible treatment to Tibetan refugees in India. But beyond that, on political questions, I think we have adopted a position of wait and watch, which has never really converted itself into a policy. And that is to our own detriment and to the detriment of the Tibetan people themselves. So I think India needs to be creative here. I agree with Dr. Joshi about all the constraints and all the sort of conditions that are required for change. But if you look at it, look at what the Chinese are doing with respect to Tibet, or what they call now the TAR, Tibetan Autonomous Region, and the BRI. They're trying to open up TAR through the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, to Nepal. But what is it the Chinese are doing which hadn't already been the case before the 1954 Panchsheel Agreement between India and China? So that kind of degree of openness is now what the Chinese want to go back to as a way of ensuring economic development and stability in Tibet. So I think, our approach to the BRI, the Indian approach to the BRI has always been, I think, quite correct on multiple issues, such as, questions of environmental standards, labor standards, financial accountability. All of that is correct. But where it came closer to India's borders, with respect to CPEC, and now I would say with respect to Tibet/TAR, I think we've adopted a rather conservative approach. And we need to be more creative on this front. I think the idea is to put the ball back in China's court and say, well, okay, you want good relations with India, open up Tibet to Indian influence or Indian culture, Indian economic, engagement. Why is it that, how much can Tibet get out of Nepal? Tibet's economy and stability, if you look at it from a cultural, in an economic perspective, it entirely is tied in with India. And as Dr. Joshi pointed out, look at the map. And in India's influence, by the way, this is not only about Tibet, but it's also extends to Xinjiang. India's influence, cultural influence, historical influence is very strong in both these regions. And unfortunately, that's precisely the reason why the Chinese have a problem, or as Dr. Joshi mentioned, are paranoid about India. So, in your question, I think you very sort of briefly said that one way that India, if India-China relations improve, this is better for Tibet. I don't think anything that India does with respect to Tibet will I mean, even if India has a positive or a cooperative approach on Tibet, or India has a hardline approach on Tibet, this is not going to matter to the Communist Party regime in Beijing. Anything that India does with respect to Tibet is going to be seen as a problem as far as China is concerned. And unless China changes that attitude, is more willing to open up to India inside Tibet, walk back maybe from some of those clauses of the 1954 Panchil Agreement, I don't think there is any forward movement possible. I mean, we need to be thinking more creatively. This way at standstill between hardline, approaches on both sides is not going to change the situation dramatically.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jabin, and thank you to all our speakers for raising really important points on India's policy on Tibet. And another important issue that I want to talk about related to Tibet is the succession of the current Dalai Lama and the future of the Dalai Lama institution. This matter will have significant impacts on both bilateral relations and global relations. And the Buddhist communities in the Himalayan regions of India who actually hold Indian citizens are the key stakeholders of this process. So should India take a stronger role on this issue? How might this influence the situation? We'll start with Dr. Swati. We'll start with you.
Thank you. And thank you for foregrounding the Himalayan peoples in the framing of this question. I think that's very important. And not just Himalayan Buddhists, but actually all Himalayan peoples. If you travel, for example, I mean, even to a place like Ladakh, you would see that gratitude, reverence for the Dalai Lama flows very organically among all religious communities, across the Himalayas. So it isn't just about the Buddhists. But yes, the question of reincarnation is important. But just want to take a step back here, and in response to the previous question, and the two are connected. I had argued in a piece at the time that India should know more about Tibet because this is also Indian history. So it isn't just about, and where are the Himalaya in India's understanding, in the Indians' understanding of India. So India isn't just Delhi. It isn't just, the plains. Where are the mountains? So I think this courses on Tibetology or programs like Vibrant Villages, part of which was collecting histories going back to 2000 years of these villages on the borders. I think they're also important for us to understand our place, within South Asia better. So on the question of reincarnation, yes, I think India needs to take a stronger position, a clear position. So for example, in December of 2022, the Indian Himalayan Council of the Nalanda Buddhist tradition had passed a resolution saying that the people of the Himalayas will never accept a candidate for the Dalai Lama that was chosen by the PRC, and they would publicly denounce the move. And we know that several countries across the world, so the US, we know the Tibet Policy Support Act, have said that they would respect the wishes of the Dalai Lama and of the Tibetan people. So I think that is the position, according to me, that that's the most sensible position. And we cannot talk about the question of reincarnation without foregrounding Tibetans in exile and in Tibet. So in a situation where there are two rival claimants to the title, and we know this from the example of the Panchen Lama that was installed by the Chinese, is the person going to have legitimacy in the eyes of Tibetans? And again, to remember, most Tibetans live within Tibet, not in exile. And even within exile, the fact that the population of Tibetans has been declining. And in fact, now for the first time, the number of Tibetans who live in exile in South Asia and outside of South Asia is almost 50-50. So I think this question of reincarnation, where the next one would be discovered, it also ties into the future of Tibetans who live in exile. So what is it going to mean for them and their wishes, on the subject? And also, what can India do to assuage concerns? So Jabin said very rightly that actually India has had, across governments, a fairly consistent policy towards Tibetans in exile, and fairly, supportive and friendly, beginning from Nehru The sense in those very first meetings between the Dalai Lama and Nehru that the preservation of culture is important, and for that, the preservation of language, religious traditions is important, and that's what is tied to the destiny, of Tibetans in exile. So I think that India needs to assuage these fears, these concerns about what would happen to the position of Tibetans who live in exile in that scenario. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swati. And Dr. Joshi, you have also mentioned earlier saying that you have mentioned the reincarnation of His Holiness in one of your writings. So can you please share about your perspective on this?
Well, His Holiness has said many things about reincarnation. At some point, he has said that he may not reincarnate at all. You see, the point obviously is that should His Holiness reincarnate, and should that reincarnation be outside historical Tibet, the Chinese will come up with their own reincarnation and say, we have the real Dalai Lama. You see? So the point is that it will be very difficult for a successor to have the kind of authority that His Holiness has today. You see? That's one thing. Secondly, the second important thing which we have been reading about, which I am not, since I'm not a Tibetologist, but His Holiness and people around him has also been talking about the concept of emanation. The problem with the Dalai Lama reincarnation is that it takes you 20 years to become an adult. And 20 years is too long a time in history, in history to be waiting for the next Dalai Lama. So the concept of emanation provides an option through which His Holiness can emanate. Now, all this is Tibetan tradition. And that is why I say that I don't think it is up to India or to China or anyone. It is the Tibetans who have to be central in this process. It is their beliefs and their customs which must be respected. And I think the Chinese need to learn this very clearly, because as is well known, they have a famous office where they say that anyone who reincarnates has to be authorized by this office. Now, which is a ridiculous position for the Chinese. So, but what is definitely there is that this issue of the succession of the Dalai Lama in whatever form, whether it is emanation, whether it is through reincarnation, has major implications. Has major implications for the stability of Tibet. And when it comes to the Himalayan region, I need to point out to you that one major problem, at least the Indian side of the Himalayas faces, or even the Chinese side, is that it is a very difficult terrain, the border terrain, extremely difficult. I'm a Himalayan person. I come from a Himalayan region. People don't want to live there. You have deserted villages, thousands of houses, no one is living in there. So I'm not sure this vibrant villages and all that. See, it's all right in China where you can force people to live somewhere. You can order them to live somewhere. But it's quite different in a country like India where if someone doesn't like it, he just ups and he goes off somewhere else. And it is a major problem because life is extremely difficult up in the mountain areas. And I'm sure it is so even in the Tibetan mountain areas. So I think we have a very complex situation ahead of us. It certainly would be very beneficial if the Chinese eased up on this and the borders were opened up. I remember my childhood open borders in Tibet. My grandfather has traveled to Kailash. My father had traveled to Kailash. I have not had that opportunity. So it was not uncommon for people to travel to Tibet in those days, or to see Tibetans coming from Tibet down to India during the winter. I think we need policies which would actually open up. I mean, say if you can talk of opening up Jammu and Kashmir border as we tried in 2008, 2009, we can certainly try reopening the India-Tibet border in a much more substantial fashion. And I think, move away from some of the more confrontational strategies, which are not really leading anyone anywhere. As I said, in my view, I don't think even a war would have any, given the nature of the Himalayan terrain, any war would in the Himalayas would be inconclusive today. So I think we need a very different approach to this situation.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. And I think, Swati, you need to make a very quick point.
Yeah, just very quickly, so not just the Dalai Lama, the other lineage holders are important as well. So I think the Indian government perhaps needs a policy, like just as towards the other lineages too. And the quick point I wanted to make was His Holiness is still around, and something that I have argued, and many others have argued, is that India should bestow its highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna, on the Dalai Lama during his lifetime. Because, I mean, not as a card, like not as a signal to China, but just an acknowledgement of what the Dalai Lama and what Tibetans in exile have done for the Himalayan people and for India more broadly. So I did want to say that we are talking about the reincarnation, but we can do more to honor the current Dalai Lama.
Thank you. Thank you, Swati, so much for your thoughtful note. We'll move on to Dr. Jacob.
Okay, I just have a very quick point to make, which is the point that Swati made about other lineages. I think that's important. As Dr. Joshi pointed out, the next Dalai Lama, it's a 20-year process. So I think part of India's Tibet policy is really our approach to the other lineages, the Panchen Lama, the Karmapa. We have to figure this out. So that's one. The second is given that the Dalai Lama himself has talked about multiple Tibetan traditions, as Dr. Joshi pointed out, of reincarnation, of emanation, I think for India, I mean, no matter what India does, no matter what the Dalai Lama does, the first blowback, the first consequence is for India, because that's who the Chinese will blame for whatever happens on this front, right? So in that sense, I think we need. I mean, India will certainly need. I mean, I can see it from how policymakers think. I think policymakers will need much more of a surety or of a guarantee from the Tibetan, the exile movement, from the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan government in exile, about where this reincarnation process is going. Because without that, India cannot really commit, beyond what it has done so far, at least on the question of the reincarnation. So this is really up to the Tibetans, right, about how they are going to resolve this question about the Dalai Lama's reincarnation. And unless they do this, they are putting actually India in a very, very difficult spot, because for no fault of India's, frankly, the Chinese are going to, use whatever advantages they have on the LAC to target India. So this is something that the Tibetans have to think about very, very seriously. And given what Swati just mentioned, I mean, it is true that the 6 million Tibetans live inside Chinese-controlled territory. But since the Dalai Lama lives outside of Chinese-controlled territory in India, and there has to be some discussion between the Indians and the Tibetan side on this question. And this is, I think, a sine qua non for forward movement on this particular issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacob. Adil, let's hear your perspective on this.
A lot has already been said about this question of reincarnation of His Holiness. I just want to add this point that as Swati was mentioning, there are enough Tibetans now outside of the Indian subcontinent. It's the first time we have a new kind of scenario, and this is where the Tibetan community themselves also has to decide on their own that where do they stand on this issue. It is an important point or topic of discussion for India, but it's the Tibetans themselves that need to be given enough room to make their choices of what do they desire as an outcome. And with what His Holiness has said so far, there could be an emanation, a reincarnation. So we are left in kind of a limbo that China is at the moment exploiting. Looking at their options, they have decided that they are going to find their next Dalai Lama inside China. That's for sure going to happen. But India at this juncture can do the best is to give Tibetans the room, the political space to have a Dalai Lama. May it be within the Indian subcontinent, may it be outside. That's up to the Tibetans. The best that India can do at this point is that. But having more clarity from the Indian side is important because, as what Dr. Jacob was saying, the blowback will be towards India, whatever happens from the Chinese side. They're going to blame India for taking sides. And it's going to be a global issue once again. The US will be involved in that. We can't discount other, parties playing a role as well. Even Taiwan has a stake in this issue, a long history of, ties with Tibet. The issue of visit of Dalai Lama to Taiwan is hanging around. People have requested that, but it's not happened. A very kind of political issue where India also plays a role, as well as other, candidates who have not been able to travel as freely. There are some policy decisions from the Indian side to curtail the travels, and there are certain, logic behind that. But I would say India can do the best is to give that space to the Tibetan community to find the next Dalai Lama and let that process happen naturally. Let China not hijack it.
Thank you so much, Adil, and thank you so much to all our speakers for sharing your perspective, this very informative perspective on the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also acknowledging the reincarnation of the other lineages as well. Now, coming back to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, where are bilateral relations headed under Modi's third term, and how will the coalition government deal with China? We can see that China, Adil mentioned, that China is already annoyed with PM Narendra Modi accepting the congratulations from the Taiwanese president Lai Ching-te. So China often gets furious when countries publicly acknowledge Taiwan's independent status. So, if Modi is politically weaker now, will this make it easier or harder for India to negotiate with Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party? China seems to separate the border issue from other aspects of his relationship with India, which is unacceptable to India. Will there be efforts to reduce military presence and tension along the line of control, LAC, or will the border conflict continue or worsen relations? In a world increasingly polarized between the US and China, where does this leave India? We'll start with Dr. Manoj.
Well, all I can say is that at present, Chinese strategy and Chinese policy is aimed at maintaining its dominance over India. They believe that India is a second or third level power, and as is well known, in the Chinese system, they view the whole world in an hierarchical manner. They don't view us as equals. The only country they view as an equal is the United States. So, as long as China views us as a second or third level power, there is a problem, obviously. But we are also witnessing the possibility that there will be a relative decline of China's economic strength and a fairly quick rise of India's economic capabilities. Now, in those circumstances, you see, the Chinese being hard-headed people, once they realize that India is not really stoppable, meaning they've done everything so far, whether it is South Asia, whether it's the Indian Ocean, whether it's the Sino-Indian border, Chinese policies have always been to somehow keep India off balance. Now, having tried all that, if they still do not succeed and India continues to grow, I think the Chinese will have to readjust their policy. And they will come to a point. And my thing is, a lot of it depends on what we here in India are able to do to India itself. If India is able to get its act together as a fast rate of economic growth. Everything is there going for India right now. And the great advantage of India is that if you look at the global system, you do not have the kind of suspicion of India, of the kind of suspicion that people are have a suspicion of China. No one has a similar negative kind of attitude towards India. So a lot of it, as I said, depends on the trends in the next decade. And those trends could actually lead us to the point where the Chinese are compelled to have a relook at their policy, where they look at India as a second or a third level player.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj. And I would also like to say that, for our previous question, that Asia Freedom Institute has also released a report on the issue of the reincarnation of the next Dalai Lama, titled "The Next Dalai Lama," and you can get the book from Asia Freedom Institute's website. I'll move on to Adil. Adil, you have also written a piece on the PLA commander who, according to the Chinese, claims that he was one of the survivors during the Galwan clash, right? So he said that he once mentioned, saying that, I would rather sacrifice my life than lose an inch of my land. So according to you, where do you see this relationship going, India and China's?
Thank you for that question. That was Chief Abao. He had mentioned, defending borderland. And this is the narrative that has consistently built up over the last few years. National security has become a driving force behind thinking in China. And what he was somewhat channeling is, and now he's become a celebrity in China, where his videos are constantly, shown on state media, is a new kind of ideology which seeks to defend borderlands, be it Tibet, be it Taiwan, and they kind of club together. Indian border issue was not that prominent a few years ago. It's only much more recently with Xi Jinping. It's become a kind of a central issue for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and it's been given a new status. We can see this, Xi Jinping has at times spoken to soldiers at the border. He's done video chat with them during the New Year celebrations, and this is kind of giving a new status to that. So what he was saying is essentially channeling this ideology that a lot of people in China now believe, that these borders need to be defended. We have kind of been not there for a long time, because I think the way I look at it is that certain sections of the eastern Ladakh region, the infrastructure on the Chinese side was not exactly there. So they are building these new airports and helipads to ensure that the reality on the ground is slowly changed. And this has happened with, Galwan clashes. That may have been an accident, based on some of the analysis and what Dr. Joshi has also written in his book, that incident may have been actually an accident that both sides had not desired. But what was happening is China was building up towards a kind of creating a new narrative of borders that had not existed. Now they are doing things in South China Sea with Philippines. You can see the same kind of, defending the motherland narrative playing out in these regions as well. And so I think this ideology is not going anywhere, and it's now a central theme of the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping has made it a central theme, and other aspects or the other functionaries of the party have to abide by it.
Thank you so much, Adil. We'll move on to Dr. Jacob. Let's hear your perspective on this.
Okay, so hopefully coalition politics in India means wisdom in India's China policy. The Chinese, however, will be very mistaken if they think that coalition politics in India necessarily weakens India's foreign policy approaches. That is a mistake that they would make to their own cost. I think structurally, situation has gone so far ahead that both the Indian side and the Chinese side are now very strongly sort of set in along the LAC. And as Dr. Joshi mentions, it's very unlikely that a local conflict on the LAC will escalate into an all-out war. This is not happening. This is not possible. And it's more likely stalemate rather than any conclusive decisions on the LAC. As far as, what Adil's point, I mean, the point that you mentioned about, the Prime Minister Modi responding to the Taiwanese president's tweet, I think so far it's only the Chinese President Xi Jinping who has not yet responded or congratulated Prime Minister Modi. I mean, it's open to everybody to congratulate as soon as they want on social media these days. So there is actually something there. Plus the fact that Xi Jinping among the P5 countries, he's the only. China is the only country whose president hasn't congratulated Prime Minister Modi. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has responded with a tweet, but that's neither here nor there. But it's also important to note that the Chinese organized a visit by the Pakistan Prime Minister at exactly the same time that the election results were to be out in India. So they're also sending a message to India about how serious they are with about improving India-China relations. So I think we need to look at all of this in context to see how India-China relations is proceeding. It's not solely about a weaker mandate for Prime Minister Modi in India, but it's also what Adil talked about, the ideology that is now increasingly taken root in China about not giving up a single inch of territory. I mean, this is not a solution. This is not a approach towards achieving solution in anything. If the Chinese are unwilling to compromise, India-China relations are going to be just as bad as ever.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. Dr. Swati, let's hear yours.
Yeah, and since I'm getting the last word, I also want to say that the invitations that Prime Minister Modi sent out to his swearing-in ceremonies in 2014, 2019, and 2024, there's a story there too. So we know that in 2014, for example, Lok Sabha was there, and then, so who gets dropped and who's included in these three? I think there is a mini narrative there. But since we are ending, and a part of your question was the polarization, of the world between China and the US, I also wanted to say, there has been this conversation in Asia about the India way or the China way. And since this is the Asia Freedom Institute, maybe we could end with what does this election mean for what are Indian or what are South Asian, what are the values? So if you think about democracy, about federalism, religious tolerance, so, coalition and federalism, coalition government and federalism, maybe thinking about those together, what does it mean? So what is the Indian way? What have these elections taught us? Maybe that could be an interesting, point of reflection as we end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swati. And I know everybody everybody have been here, and they maybe like you have other commitments to us. So I really thank all our speakers for giving us your extra time for this discussion. And thank you to all our speakers for your insightful contributions and thoughtful discussion. I really appreciate you taking out your valuable time to speak with Asia Freedom Institute. I would also like to thank everyone who is involved for the discussion today. The video for the session will be uploaded on Asia Freedom Institute's websites, and I'd like to request all of you to please follow Asia Freedom Institute's social media platforms, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram pages for more information on AFI programs and activities. We are also now available both on Apple Podcast and YouTube. Thank you so much once again to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.